CES is the best place on earth to imagine what our future will hold. From self-driving cars to the latest in artificial intelligence, 5G connectivity to digital health and therapeutics, CES is the epicenter of global innovation and creativity. The executives joining us for the next CES keynote are leading the charge to build this new tech-enabled future. Julie Sweet is CEO of Accenture, the global professional services firm with more than 500,000 employees worldwide. Her job is to help the world's biggest companies figure out the future. She understands how diversity and inclusion benefit a company's bottom line. And she's committed to creating a more diverse, inclusive, and equal workplace. In 2020, she was named #1 on the Fortune's list of most powerful women in business. And Julie is joined by Michael Miebach, president of MasterCard. Michael began his tenure as CEO on January 1 after more than a decade with the company. He spent 2020 serving as the company's president and CEO-elect. And along the way, he has been a key driver in helping MasterCard to diversify its product offerings. As Chief Product Officer at MasterCard, Michael helped expand MasterCard's offerings from consumer cards to digital-first products like the Apple Card, blockchain, digital identity, and a variety of multi-rail payment solutions. And both Julie and Michael demonstrate a passion and commitment to technologies that improve lives and make for more inclusive communities. Today, they're going to be interviewed by Dan Roth, editor-in-chief of LinkedIn News, and explore how tech is solving the world's biggest challenges and the trends that are going to define our next decade. Please join me in welcoming Julie, Michael, and Dan to CES.
Hello, CES. Welcome to 2021. It is great to have you here. We are talking to you in whatever room you're in. I'm doing this from my attic. Our two great guests we're going to find out where they are in a second, but what we are going to cover in this session is what we are seeing in terms of how technology is changing the economy and companies over the next 10 years. What are the trends that are driving all of this change? Which ones can you bet on? And how has the last year accelerated or changed what we expect to see over the next decade? So I'm thrilled to welcome to the stage Julie Sweet, the CEO of Accenture, and Michael Miebach, the new CEO of MasterCard. Welcome to you both. Are you there? Let's just start. Where are we reached you? Julie, where are you right now?
I am in my home office, which is where I've been since COVID began, since the pandemic was declared.
Okay, great. And were you prepared to work out of your home, or was this something that you were just kind of like hunkering in place and now it has turned, you've kind of built an office around you?
I did. I already had a home office. Accenture is, for decades has actually not even had a headquarters. And so when I wasn't on the road, I did work out of my home office. So for us as a company, it was a pretty seamless transition because we don't have a headquarters. For example, my leadership team is all around the world. And in fact, my CFO and I both live in Washington, D.C. area. And it's the first time the CEO and CFO of Accenture have been in the same office in something like 30 years. So that part was pretty seamless. Now, doing it permanently, that's a different conversation.
Right. All right. Well, we're going to get into that and find out any tips and tricks you have as well for how we should all be managing right now. Michael, where are we catching you?
You're catching me in Purchase, New York. Think about a better location for a company called MasterCard, as in being in Purchase. So this is one of our conference rooms. Throughout the crisis, I've mostly been here because travel wasn't possible. Normally, like Julie, I would be on the road, but there wasn't much being on the road. So we bunkered out here at our head office. And we do have a head office.
How many people are working in the head office right now?
We have about a 10% show rate. Normally, it's about 2,000 people here. It is that policy of you work where you need to work, whatever makes most sense of you, is something that we've done for years, and now we needed to do it. So it's only critical people that are coming in.
That's great. Well, let's start with the discussion about how this pandemic has changed some of these trends in how we're seeing how business is going to change over the next decade. We were talking before the session, and some of the data that really jumped out at me, that both of you shared, was how companies and consumers have accelerated their approach towards digital over this last year, as we've been stuck at home, or as we've been thinking about how to motivate or work with employees who are spread all over. So, Julie, let's start with you. What are you hearing back from from C-suite people you're surveying or from other clients you're working with about how this last year has changed how they're doing business? And then, Michael, I'd love to hear the same from you about customers.
Sure. I think when we take a step back, remember that COVID hit while we were already in the middle of, really revolutionary change in technology. And it's interesting, pre-COVID, I'd be on lots of panels where we were still discussing the value of technology, and literally overnight, technology became a lifeline, right? And I remember early in the crisis, many CEOs talking to me about how, look, I had parts of the company that said we could never work remotely that are suddenly, closing the books and doing all of these things. And so the mindset has had a massive change. And I think there's really two important pivots from a technology point of view that are both here to stay, but really going to drive massive change in both how companies operate, but what they can do for their consumers as well. And that is the shift to the cloud, which was a big trend pre-COVID, but something we thought would take more like a decade. And what we see today is we're about 20% in the cloud if you look across industries, and we think that companies will get to about 80% on average, large companies, by 2025, a massive acceleration. And that is really a once in a digital era re-platforming of global business that has a lot of implications that I'm sure we'll get into. But the second pivot is really the role of artificial intelligence. And this is something we're seeing every day. If you think about how, for example, contact centers for governments had to completely change. Governments have been slow to change, but all of a sudden they had thousands of citizens who needed vital information. And we started not just automating and doing things, but using artificial intelligence to answer inquiries. You've seen supply chain disruptions, consumers changing behavior, and you needed the data, but then the actual ability to predict new behaviors really coming from, for the most advanced companies, the ability to now use artificial intelligence to have different kinds of predictions and understanding of their business. And I think that's something that hasn't been talked about as much post-crisis, but it is what we are seeing, particularly those of our clients who were leaders pre-crisis in putting the foundation in and ahead in the cloud, and is really, we think, over the next 12 to 18 months going to differentiate them.
That's great. And I want to get into that more, especially because those build on early wins in AI and in cloud build on each other. So it sounds like what you're saying is there's probably going to be a separation for people who are investing now versus people who might come on a little bit later. Before we get into that, Michael, what are you saying?
Well, Dan, you said earlier, how about looking at consumers? So we just talked a little bit about what Julie sees on the business side. On the consumer side, if you think about our business, in spending data on how people pay for goods and services is a nice reflection of what is going on in the economy. We could have seen from the early days of the lockdown until where we are now is how consumer behavior has changed, and it has changed quite dramatically. I would argue it's worth to say that years of digital acceleration have been kind of compressed into months. You take one data point which I quite find really fascinating. At the end of last year, the portion of commerce here in the US that was e-commerce was about 20%, just under 20%, and a year ago, before that, it was 13%. That is a seismic shift. So the key question then is, people were forced to stay home. They were forced to use e-commerce because there was no other way to do it. Which of these trends are going to stick? And that's the key question we're asking ourselves, and we've asked consumers. And every single month since April 2020, we've asked around 14 markets around the world, what do you believe? And with rising cases, consumer confidence went lower. And when in the summer, when things looked a lot better, consumer confidence was rising. Everybody was saying, well, This is fantastic. I'm going to use all these fantastic digital payment tools and online consumption, all of that. I will do it afterwards, after the crisis subsides, just as much. But I also want to go back and shop at my local business around the corner. So it's a bit of this as a tale of two cities. Yes, the digital trend will stick, but I also want to revert to what I was doing before because I really like that. In the end, where it's going to play out, our prediction is that about 2/3 of that trend towards e-commerce is going to stick. And it's going to stick wherever it's a better solution than what was out there in terms of physical experience before. If you want to go to a shop and you're going to talk, you get great advice from the guy that you know in your local town, fantastic. That is a better experience. But repeatable purchases, the way you don't really have any advantage by being in a shop, why wouldn't you do what you just started to learn throughout the crisis? So about 2/3 will retain. That's our view.
It's interesting how much those two play into each other. This idea that consumers spend more of their time online buying just gives more data to Julie's customers to be able to apply artificial intelligence and figure out how to get those people to come back, and it's going to force companies, I would assume, to adopt this technology even faster because their customers are demanding it, because their consumers are demanding it. Julie, would you talk a little bit about how this is? First of all, how are companies? It is one thing to say, I know I have to digitize. I know I've got to do this right. I know I've got to move to the cloud. I've got to be in AI, but pulling that off is a totally different. Area. You've got it's the right hiring, it's the right technology. Are companies, do they have what they need, and do they understand what it is going to take to make this jump?
Well, Dan, the answer, of course, is it depends, right? So, what Michael is talking about, what you're talking about, we've kind of coined the term compressed disruption, right? Because what's happening right now is that in order to do all of the different things that companies have to do, they're having to transform multiple parts of their organization at once, where they were going to do it more sequentially. And to build a little bit on what Michael said is these trends build on each other, right? So you have e-commerce spending, but at the same time, you have the whole idea of remote working. And our latest survey just from January says that about 65% of people who were not working from home before expect this will continue, right? Our latest pulse also said that there's 15% of consumers who never want to go back to a store. So not just using e-commerce, but like literally never going back to bricks and mortar. But you also have the telehealth trends, and all of them build on each other, right? In terms of like consumer behaviors. And so as a company, you have employees who have certain expectations, you're providing health care, you're reaching your consumers, and all of that really means you have to think about transforming much more quickly. And, the reality is that, a year before we went into COVID, when we did our research to look at 10 industries, 8,000 companies across the world, and we measured companies by digital adoption, breadth and depth, leadership and culture, the top 10% were doing twice as well as the bottom 25%. So we call the leaders versus the laggards. That gap literally widened overnight, right? And so what I would say to you is that as we look at companies, there's two important areas that companies are really competing on right now. The first is those who were leaders have an overnight, digital leaders, overnight competitive advantage. And so the question is, can they capitalize it on it? But for the rest of the companies, right, I would say it's a question of leadership. Because what is required isn't simply go implement some technology, right? It's the courage to do compressed disruption of your own business, right? It's the willingness to like rethink. And I talk a lot about the humility to look at other industries, other companies, and to partner to do it fast. And so if I was in the business of investing, right, I would probably be most focused on the quality of the leadership, because that is really what it's going to take. Because you can do a lot of things, right? You can help companies leapfrog, et cetera, but you have to have that mindset.
But you are talking, if we think about the next decade, it sounds like what you're saying, and Michael, what you're saying also is that there is going to be a pretty big shift in. It sounds like we are entering a world where the rich are going to get richer, or the people who are figuring this out are going to just increase this chasm between the two, and you're going to see companies who are getting how to make sure that they are providing for these people who don't want to leave home, the few who still want to go back to shopping in person, who are willing to leave their homes. But most of us are going to be pretty comfortable being here, working here, living, doing all of our buying from our homes. Is that going to create a kind of an even bigger gap between the big companies and the small companies? Is there hope for some of these smaller or slower players?
Well, Dan, I think this gap has been there between small companies and large companies, and if you look at what is themed the digital players, they have a real head start. And yes, we've been on this train of digitization, and those people are pulling ahead at this point in time. But then you start to think about small businesses. Think about hundreds of millions of small businesses. And yes, the point that Judy made on leadership, there's very courageous entrepreneurs out there, but getting out there and getting the help that you need to get your business online quickly, that takes leadership across industries. For example, in our space, in the payment space, for payment companies to step forward, enable small business for online businesses and help them to run that business. So different types of leaderships are required. And I think if that happens, and we have a broader ecosystem in mind, then I think we have a chance that the chasm between the laggards and the leaders doesn't open up any further. And I think the same actually applies to consumers. Those of us that are very comfortably at home, like you just described it, Dan, but there's others that don't have the choice to be very comfortably at home. And I think what do we need to do for them? So as we move forward, in terms of this brave new world of seamless commerce, and I can choose whatever I want to do and it's all digitally enabled, well, if you can't participate, there's no choice for you. So how do we enable that choice? And I think here, in terms of corporate leadership, there's more to be done by pulling people in. That is starting with financial inclusion, that is ensuring that you create solutions for different types of work models going forward. The gig worker is going to be more of a reality. Portable benefits for gig workers to change jobs as consumer behaviors change and different need to be satisfied, and all of that. So I think that stepping up is needed, and then we can have a digital economy that works for everybody.
And Michael, is that happening? Do you think it's happening? And is it happening fast enough that we are getting this kind of payment infrastructure and enablement to make that kind of?
I would argue this has been talked about for years, that this is needed. And COVID doesn't have many positive aspects, but I think it's one that this is a realization that this is an opportunity to do this at this point in time. So if I just look across our industry, the competitive tensions are clearly there. But the desire to work together and do something for SMEs and make sure there's lending offers and credit to access, or do something for the gig workers, I sense an increased sense of partnership.
Okay. So if you were, as we think about this session is what's going to happen in 10 years, you are confident, somewhat confident, that the underpinning that we will have a full payments infrastructure in place that allows this kind of easy movement of jobs and allows gig workers to get paid easier. Will that be in place, or will we still be slowly working our way toward it?
Well, let's hope we talk at CES 10 years from now and see if what I'm going to say is true, but I am very confident.
All right.
Julie was making the point at the beginning that this digital transformation has been going on, and we've all kind of working on that. So the homework has been done. In fact, we put it to good use this year. So if you look at what happened, the whole world moved online. And everything worked. We didn't miss a step as an industry. So that's fantastic. But what we did do is we did satisfy immediate crisis needs. But then you think about where is the consumer going now? And that new consumer that has just identified that doing something online is actually quite easy, and it is quite comfortable. And yes, I might have a few question marks on safety and how much data I want to give. All of those are points that are now to be thought through. How do we move from realizing crisis needs to where's the consumer now going to go with that? So continuously putting the consumer forward. And then the fundamental underlying trend that I think needs to be realized and that we need to satisfy is to ensure that there's trust in this brave new digital world. So there's going to be a lot of young people that are going to be quite happy to provide all sorts of data into this ecosystem. And then imagine a world where that trust is actually compromised. Then we could have this all unravel. So trusted networks, solutions around digital identity, safety, security, some data principles. These are all things that are not really thought about and discussed to much great degree across nations at a higher level. Some companies individually think about that, and there's some more homework to do so that that brave new world 10 years from now can actually work.
I want to switch topics a little bit, but to touch on things that both of you have talked about. Recently, Brene Brown mentioned that she found that 2020 was a year actually of two pandemics. There was the pandemic of coronavirus. There was also this pandemic of racial injustice and racial inequality, and companies realizing that they had to do much more and actually put their money where their mouth is around righting some historical wrongs. And I would love to get a sense from both of you of how over the next 10 years you see that playing out. What is the corporate role in making sure that there is equality in the workplace and making sure that you are reaching consumers of all stripes and that people all have an equal ability to get ahead? So Julie, why don't we start with you on how you're thinking about this and how your customers are, your clients are, excuse me.
Well, first of all, we have a very strong commitment at Accenture toward equality, and particularly have been focused for several years around equality and advancement of our Black employees and our Latinx and Hispanic American employees. And we took the opportunity when George Floyd was murdered to take a fresh look at how we were approaching, our commitment both within Accenture and outside of Accenture. And so we've set external goals similar to what we set back in 2015 to reach where we set it for women, that we're globally going to be at gender equality by 2025. So we have 500,000 people. We're at 45% now, so not a small goal. And we've now set external goals. And to your point around like what's our role, we really believe that as a company, starting with ourselves, we have to make sure that we are focused on equality and we're taking the steps to fight racism and to provide opportunities for advancement. We also are doing that within the communities and trying to do so as much as possible by linking with other companies, because that's where you get scaled impact. And so whether it's at the Business Roundtable, where I'm on the board and we're doing a lot of work there, the organization that Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier just started called 110, where we're one of the founding members, but really trying to work together with other companies. And I think that's an important role. And it goes really to what Michael was saying in terms of even with the competitive dynamics, right, that companies are saying we have to take a step back and we have to work together where we have common interests. And I think one of the things as we look forward is that in the past, oftentimes people talked about, principles of free market and, what is really needed to have the economy flourish. I think those principles are changing, right? Because whether it's what Michael talked about, for example, with data privacy, or it's how do you bridge the digital divide and make sure that you have internet access so that everyone can participate in e-commerce and in remote jobs, to also really providing the foundations of equality, there's really, I think, new rules being written, and I hope they'll be global, and I think there's more interest in that, where we say the fundamental principles of what is needed to make a digital economy, global economy work are different, right, than the past. And I think there's more recognition, although a ton of work to do. And of course, the issues cross. I mean, here in the US, a third of Black families do not have access to the internet. the implications of that for employment and education are enormous, right? So I would say a rewriting of what is needed to support a thriving global economy provides an opportunity for companies to work together with governments and not-for-profits in a different way.
Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, Julie, pretty much everything you just said, we think about it exactly in the same way. As it is my belief that as a company, whatever you do in terms of your business is a good starting point to see how you can address inequalities out there, because that's an expertise, that's how you make a difference. So why not leverage it to address inequalities? And that is what we have been doing for the last decade when it comes to financial inclusion. Financial inclusion, you don't have a financial identity, you cannot transact on the net, and all of that. So we pulled 500 million people into the formal financial system just to actually achieve this goal in the middle of this crisis, around about May this year. And we put another stake in the ground to pull another 500 million people, make it 1 billion out of the 2.5 billion people around the globe that are not included financially. And then the murder of George Floyd happens, and it put a spotlight on something that is widely understood and was there for a long time, but it raised it to the forefront. And we took a step back, very similar to what Julie was describing, and said, what else can we do? And it was our belief that what's at work is systematic racism. So we figured we don't need a donation. We don't need a flavor of the month. We don't need an immediate response. We need something systematic. A systematic way to address the wealth and opportunity gap and so forth. And we, linking back to my first point, what do we do as a business? How can we systematically help address that point? Well, the first thing is, you can always do better inside your own business to start with. So we put out goals where we said we will increase by 50% our VP level senior management, VP level and above. So that's good. There's obviously pay gaps and things like that, so we put formal goals around that. So that's inside the company, making sure you create the same level opportunities. But then you look outside of the company into society. What can we do on a thought leadership base? Oftentimes it's not understood widely enough why there is a wealth and opportunity gap for Black Americans, for example. So we're partnering with Rockefeller and others out there to understand and do some research around this. So that's important. And then we take that research and then we come to our own business. And that is really on the market side of our business. Do we have the right kind of solutions? Do we have the right kind of products that we're putting out there to put into the hands of Black Americans, of business owners, Black American business owners and so forth, to address the opportunity gap that they have, and significant commitment put behind that $500 million that we put across these three dimensions: our own company, what we do in terms of thought leadership across society and inside of our own business. And one of the easiest thing that any business can do is we all have suppliers. And do we have the kind of companies? Are we looking for the startups in our incubator that are Black owned? Well, the vast majority is not, but they are there if you just start looking for them, exactly what we've done. And then the same on the supplier side. So you round that all off, and then you come to the point that was, the murder of George Floyd put a specific spotlight on racism here in the United States, but we are in 200 plus countries around the world. And racism, inequality shows its face in different ways around the world. And as a global citizen, we're having different programs in different parts around the world. Financial inclusion cuts across. That's a starting point for us, but we'll need to find different approaches in Africa, in Europe, wherever else we're active.
So do you think those are both great answers? And it's really interesting to think about what implications this will have in 10 years. Will we look back and say, I know there were questions that came up after George Floyd's murder a month later, and people said, what happens when the anger dies down? What happens when the spotlight shifts, as it inevitably will? Will businesses continue to focus on this? What you're both describing is almost a rewriting of, or a kind of a rejiggering of how business thinks about what its role is. And I know, Julie, you mentioned the Business Roundtable. Business Roundtable famously came out and said, hey, we're not going to put shareholders first. That is not necessarily the focus of business. You got to think about stakeholders as well, think about society. In 10 years, will we look back and say this changed how businesses operate? We're willing to work more together. We have to think more about the impact business is having on society, or do you think this will maybe not carry over for the next, for that long?
It's a good question, because I remember back in 2016, as you may recall, there was that terrible week in the US where we had 2 Black men murdered, and then we had the ambush in Dallas. And at the time, we were optimistic that that terrible week would lead to something new. I do believe this is different. And there'll be, I'm sure, lots of academic papers written around why, and all the different events that came together. But and I believe it's, from my own perspective, different for 2 reasons. First of all, I do think this has been building, right? And we've had this, and there came this time with all these other issues where I have really seen a difference. I mean, the Business Roundtable was always focused on diversity, but was not making the types of statements and the work together that they're doing now. And it is different. You're seeing action, right? So we're going from commitment to action, and I'm seeing that privately and publicly. But there's also a very other very practical reason, is that this is good business. Right? It is good business, and it's good business on 3 dimensions. Michael can talk about better than I the consumer dimension of needing to be able to have a more, you have a very diverse consumer group, and that's true around the world, right? And they're really important and growing, and they're growing in income, et cetera. And so there's a whole, driving force behind who are your consumers. Secondly, there's the talent question. Soon after, when I was talking about this with one of my clients who's in the oil industry, who said, look, it's really hard to get people to go into the oil industry. I need to be able to tap into a broader group of people. And so they were asking for my help in thinking through how could they tap into more, because it's not been a traditional industry where they had a lot of diversity, ethnic diversity, and it's a talent issue, right? And so that is a reason as well. And then there's the diversity around innovation. I mean, we started really doubling down on diversity back in 2014 when we became the first company in my industry to set up digital. And our business was less than 20% digital, cloud, and security. It's now 70%. And we've been investing and made bold goals and have had an incredible run, right? 9% CAGR. We're the leader in our industry. And we did so because we did not believe that we could pivot our company. Think about that pivot, right? Without more diversity, so you get the innovation and the thinking. So if you think about who your buyers are, the need for talent, and then innovation, right? These are reasons why not only is it the right thing to do, but it's the right business answer. And that's why I have confidence that this is a pivotal moment, and we will have a very different, world in 10 years.
Super interesting. I love the talent component. I think you're totally right. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what is different now is that we have a unique opportunity coming out of this crisis. There's a need to rebuild, and that allows you to put aside some of the legacy and build in a different way. And I think that is generally understood, that if we're going to continue to try to do the same thing that we've done in the past, we're looking at getting back on our feet in terms of growth. It's going to require just a different approach. So the starting point is entirely different. So you're looking at not quite a blank piece of paper, but a somewhat more blank piece of paper. So that's the first thing. I think some of the aspects of what COVID has brought to us lead right into this point. I was intrigued when Julie was just talking about access to new talent pools. Working from home. What does this tell us? From a hiring perspective, I can go to communities where I can find diverse talent today because I'm much more comfortable that these people don't actually have to show up in my office in New York or Singapore or somewhere. So we're having a few, post-crisis aspects that make us think about the rebuilding in a different way. Now, the aspect of commercial viability on how you address diversity and inequality questions, we've learned that over the last decade. And this comes to this point about capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism versus just thinking about the shareholder all along. I think stakeholder capitalism here, it plays out in a way that, when we thought 10 years ago that financial inclusion is good business, we took a 10-year view. With purely a shareholder focus, we would have never done that. And we said, well, let's see what happens in 10 years. Well, we build our own market, but at the same time, we pulled people into the financial system. And that is good business. We've learned to do that. And as we look forward into new solutions, new markets, new verticals, address racism, help the SME sector, whatever it is, with that kind of a learning, I think that's going to work. And others have been on a similar trip to the point that Julie made earlier. Partnerships matter in the space, and we find more and more like-minded companies that are willing to take the longer-term view. So right now, I think it is a pivotal moment. There's no going back.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about opening up all kinds of markets for talent and for customers and new learnings that you can get as you move to a more diverse workforce and a more diverse customer base. So this is all, I think, good news, and it's going to really change, I would assume, how companies operate over the next 10 years as we just learn, as these changes happen. We only have a few minutes left. This is the Consumer Electronics Show, CES. I do want to get into this question of what kind of technologies you guys are betting on over the next few years. Is there anything you're especially excited about? Julie, you already mentioned AI, the cloud, other things that you're looking at, VR, 5G. When you are trying to prepare your companies for whatever is coming down the road, what are the ones that you're spending most of your time, or you're saying we have to understand how this works?
Sure. Well, let me just start. So I've talked about cloud and AI, which I think are two critical pivots. The third, though, is 5G. In fact, we just did some research that I wanted to share with you that we haven't yet published, where 8 in 10 executives believe that 5G will have a significant impact on their business, and 57% say it will be revolutionary. And what's interesting is that, of course, 5G has started with the consumer, right? When the first wave, and we've got, around the world, you've got people using it with your smartphones. But we're now in the wave that will really be driven by business. But what 5G will enable, right, is tied, of course, to the consumer and the ability to do more of the 3D printing, for example, 3D printing of devices, for able to provide what you want, when you want it, and where you want it. It'll change supply chains because of that. The ability to move at much greater speed, it will really transform business. And so we're spending a lot of time, because again, 5G was something that pre-COVID we believed would take a lot longer in the business world, in part because things like manufacturing were going to change much slower. They're happening much, much faster. And so as a CEO of a company, if you don't understand what is the impact on 5G on my industry, on the and on my company, right, you're missing something. And I think that 5G is probably not being talked enough about more broadly in terms of the capabilities, because pre-crisis it was thought to be, a much slower, sort of rise.
Julie, when you talk about 5G, is the biggest impact the idea of having always-on devices with you at all times that you never worry about how you're communicating with any part of your supply chain, or is it more than that?
It's because the fact of that with 5G, you don't have any delay, right? There's zero latency. If you think about how do you use technology in surgeries, right? How do you use it for autonomous driving? So the ability to use technology to really change how we live, right? When you have zero latency is massive. Right, when you think about these more important, areas and more sensitive areas, and that's where because of course we've already seen the impact like in the smartphones, but that's where you have to start opening up possibilities that that we don't have today at scale.
Awesome. Michael, what are you looking at?
Well, 5G. So how do I make this more interesting? So let's say, so we're also looking at cloud, because you obviously have to push a lot more intelligence, AI-powered intelligence, to the edge of your network. I mean, where we reach every corner and every crook of the world. And if that's your starting point and you say, okay, what else is 5G bringing? There will always be buyers and sellers. So if I look through my lens, in terms of how commerce will change over the next years, always buyers and sellers. What might change is that the buyers might not be Dan or Julie. The buyers might be a machine. So if you think about Internet of Things, tens of billions of connected devices, what will enable that? It's 5G. So on the top of the use cases that Julie just explained, some of these consumer experiences that might be there, telemedicine, whatever it is, I think the next big click forward is the world of Internet of Things and micropayments, fractional payments flying all over the world, with zero latency, as Julie was saying. I think that's where we're going to go. So it's all these foundational technologies coming together. And there would never be a good conversation around emerging technologies if we wouldn't talk about blockchain. So I just throw that in. Early at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about trust and how there needs to be trust in this brave new digital world. And that is a trust-enabling technology, which I think is going to be really critical, because there will always be buyers and sellers that don't know each other. Who is at either end of the transaction? What is being exchanged? So proof of provenance, identifying identity, those are all things that blockchain will help us do. And if you throw that on top of these other three, I think you kind of got the package.
That's great. Well, Michael and Julie, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I am looking forward, and I'd love to get a commitment from you. 2031, we meet again right here, and we review all of these and see how we did. You guys in?
There.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Michael.